So I'm Anne Campbells, and I'm here with Dean Lashana and Kate Mulligan. We're all Soon Safer Happier EMEA co-leads, and we're here today with our guest speaker, Rich Allen. And I'll just give Rich a brief introduction, if that's okay. So Rich is a social technical architect, consultant and author of a book, User Needs Mapping, Aligning Teams Around What Matters. And he's also played a key role in developing and teaching team topologies, which some of you may also be aware of. Indeed, we've had Matthew Skelton in this meetup group giving a session not too long ago with John Smart. And Rich has over 2 decades of experience across software engineering, team leadership and organizational design, and he blends mapping, systems thinking, something that's close to my heart, and practical facilitation to help organizations move from being misaligned and feeling dependency pain towards clarity, autonomy and faster flow. And today we have Rich talking to us about user needs as a North Star, so rethinking alignment in complex organizations. And yeah, really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say, Rich, and we'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks very much for inviting me to come and chat with you today. It's a nice close group, so I really enjoy these kind of conversations. I really want it to be not just me about kind of talking at you. We can make it a conversation, so feel free to kind of add any questions into the chat as I'm speaking. And we'll see if we can answer them if it makes sense, but there'll be time at the end for any questions if we need to as well. Let me start off by sharing my screen and make sure that works. So I'm going to share this screen like that, and then hopefully I'll get some thumbs up that say you can see the screen. Awesome. Perfect. Thank you very much. Yes, so yeah, thanks very much for having me here today. Absolute pleasure to be here. So what I'll probably be doing is start off by exploring some kind of typical challenges that are faced by many organizations, then introduce sort of user needs mapping and how I believe it can help us start to sort of sense make and increase our situational awareness, really, to improve how teams interact and how we make decisions about those team interactions within organizations. I'll kind of run through a bit of a small case study, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. It's probably going to be about 35 minutes or so kind of speaking, so hopefully plenty of time for questions. So before I kind of get into the main topics, quick intro to myself. So my name is Rich Allen, as Anne quite rightly introduced. So I'm based in sunny Bournemouth on the south coast of England, and I'm the father of 3 teenagers, and hence why I have grey hair. I'm actually only 22 years old now. I'm not that. I'm about 49, but plenty of grey hair. So maybe a quick test of the chat. Then we've already kind of seen where anybody is in the world, but who's kind of father of children or mother of children? Have we got kids in there? Yes, no's, maybes. Just see if I'm resonating with anybody else's pain with 3 teenagers. I'm really kind of regretting having those at the same time. Yes, a couple of kids in there. Awesome. No worries if not, obviously. So yep, I've had 2 decades of kind of experience with agile ways of working. I kind of got my introduction to agile really quite early on, back in 2003. I think around the time actually the Agile Manifesto kind of came out, and I was working in a startup and decided that actually we're doing waterfall stuff. We should try out this agile kind of way of working. Cut my teeth early, and then have been obsessed about helping organizations sort of improve processes, improve ways of working, improve how teams work ever since then. I've been a hands-on developer, team leader, CTO in various different guises, and I'm the author of the book, User Needs Mapping. So it's going to be the main focus of the talk. But quick question, and I won't be offended if there's no's, but has anyone actually read the book out of interest? Came out in October. Maybe in the chat, yes or no, if you read the book. Oh, we've got a yes. Woo-hoo. Not yet, but it's on the list, right? Excellent. We've got some readers just downloaded today. Amazing. Okay, so it published in October 2025, so the end of the last year, and really came out of my work with the team topologies side of things. So I've been working closely with Matthew and Manuel, who wrote the team topologies book, and essentially working with different organizations across all shapes and sizes across the world to adopt the kind of patterns and principles. And one of the patterns and principles, or the approaches that I actually brought to the table back in 2020, was user needs mapping. And essentially, we started using it on various different engagements to help us reason about how organizations were structured, what their current landscape was. And essentially, 4 years later, decided I should write a book about it because it's actually quite useful, and we'll be exploring that a bit further. So, sooner, safer, happier. Hopefully everyone on the call has read this one and probably knows it thoroughly. But ultimately, I think when we often find organizations try to adopt the ideas and things from sooner, safer, happier, the leaders generally kind of agree with the principles, right? Focusing on outcomes, reducing batch sizes, empowering teams, learning quickly. But it often comes down to like how we actually operationalize those ideas into real organizations. That becomes the trickier bit. And so sooner, safer, happier is asking us, we should optimize for outcomes, not just for outputs. But when we typically kind of ask that question, we often find that the question actually becomes, well, what outcomes are we actually thinking about, and for what user? And that's kind of often where it becomes a bit kind of fuzzy. So leaders might have a clear idea of the strategy, but actually a team struggle to connect that to their day-to-day work. And it's not necessarily because the strategy is wrong, but in my opinion, it's because there's actually a missing translation layer potentially. So let me just walk through an example of how we might typically see flow of work through an organization, and just if any of this resonates, feel free to pop in the chat. So flow of value going across from left to right. So typically what we might find is that the business determines what they want, and they want to collaborate, and they collaborate with the PMO, the program management office, or project management office, to capture these initiatives. And then that work is kind of typically handed over to, say, business analysts or architects and security, or maybe a selection of sort of technical leads. And then together they kind of assess the feasibility, the potential architecture, highlight any concerns, and determine the potential size. And then that's handed back to the business analysts and the PMO to then plan and start to coordinate across teams. And then we actually arrange a bit of a kickoff with the actual team. So this is sort of typically the first time that the teams have actually seen the work that they need to do. We then find that the teams all kind of start work at the same time, but they're tightly coupled. They've kind of got this idea of what we call temporal coupling. So they might start work at the same time, but they have to coordinate via sprints, and they can't actually deliver work independently. And then each team has to collaborate and coordinate and synchronize with each other in order to get that work done, until finally the teams kind of collaborate with a change approval board, and the changes are sequenced for release into production and given to the operations team to actually run. And then if we're lucky, the business actually might turn around and say, well, did that actually work? Does that kind of resonate with anyone? Does that feel like something they've experienced previously? Pop in the chat. Yeah, kind of seen all that before. A few thumbs up, 100%. So like this is common for what we see, and often people describe it as being like, it just feels like this big ball of mud, right? How work flows through the system is really it's a complex problem. So what we see is, or what I see is, that there's a missing anchor. There's what we're trying to do is potentially trying to connect strategy directly to the teams without necessarily being clear about how or what the outcomes are that we're trying to achieve. And so in my view, the missing anchor is that connection to user needs. And so the user needs shape essentially the strategic choices that we're going to be making in order to achieve the desired outcomes. And it's that strategy that shapes or is informed by those user needs. It shapes the strategic choices that we're going to make. And that work is what then needs to flow through the organization in order to produce the output, which then meets those user needs. And it's the meeting of those user needs, the helping those users make progress to get their job done, is what we're looking to achieve. That's the outcome. That's the desired outcome we're looking for. But when we find that that work typically tries to flow through the organization, we need to pay attention to actually how we organize those teams in order to meet those needs. And if we don't make intentional decisions, about how those teams interact, then the flow of value is going to be slowed down as teams sort of have to hand over to each other. And so we might actually find that they're handing over, teams are trying to coordinate across tightly coupled systems. So it becomes a bit of a challenge. So then what we kind of find is that we might have high coupling and low cohesion. So when teams tend to when we have high coupling and low cohesion, teams tend to experience high cognitive load, right? There's frequent context switching. We might see burnout. We might see overall reduced performance. And that's because our teams aren't necessarily aligned or in a way that is actually meeting those needs. But when we actually see teams with low coupling and high cohesion, then we start to see reduced cognitive load with less context switching and far higher performance from the teams. So the question then becomes, how do we then start shifting towards this kind of low coupling, high cohesion from something that might be more highly coupled? And obviously, any Sooner Safer Happier bookworms out there that know that on page 278, there's this particular diagram that I'm going to lean towards. But essentially, it's important to recognize that loosely coupled systems do support higher delivery performance, but loosely coupled systems don't just kind of emerge accidentally. We need to be intentional about how they get there. And so they emerge when we have deliberate boundaries, we've got responsibilities that are coherent, and we've got teams that aren't overloaded. And so we need to recognize that our organizations are made up of both humans and technology. And we know kind of through Conway's law and organizational structure, the actual organization structure is going to actually drive the architecture through this socio-technical mirroring, or the mirroring of the communication channels. So how we design our teams will actually influence the architecture, and then vice versa, the architecture will influence the organization structure. So it will constrain, however we've built our existing architecture is going to influence and constrain how we structure our teams. And so the important thing here really is that organizations are socio-technical systems. So they're complex adaptive systems made up of humans, people, and technical side of things. There's two sides of the coin. And we need to evolve both things at the same time. When we change one part of the socio-technical system, it will impact the other. Changing org structure will impact architecture and vice versa. So with that in mind, kind of thinking in that framing, this is where user needs mapping kind of really comes in. It's not necessarily like a framework to implement, but it's more of a collaborative visual sense-making tool that helps teams and leaders start to see things through a slightly different lens. And then once it's kind of visible, those team interactions become a lot less sort of political and more evidence-informed. So it's just a different way of viewing your organization in order to reason about the socio-technical implications. And so what we typically find is by making the conversations about a user needs map rather than about what's in people's heads, we can start to have more informed conversations. So what is this user needs mapping that we are speaking about, and how can it help? Well, ultimately, it just follows this fairly straightforward user needs chain of influence. So it starts with the fact that the user experiences the need. That's the job to be done, the problem to be solved, the challenge. That's the thing that we need to solve. And so that will shape the work that we need to do. So based on that need, that's the work that we need to do in order to meet that need. The work that we need to do will then inform our kind of socio-technical systems. So how our humans and our technology need to interact in order to deliver that value effectively. And then how the socio-technical system is configured will shape how value flows back out to produce the output, which ultimately meets the user need and achieves their desired outcome. Does that make sense to anyone? Has anyone got any questions on that at this point? Heart pounding, a couple of thumbs up. Awesome. So typically then, this is how I see the flow of value. So it's a circular kind of thing that starts with user needs and it ends with user needs. Flow of value is identifying what's driving the need of the user, working out how we can best deliver that as an organization, and then producing output that satisfies those needs. And then that will influence the broader environment, the technical system, and there might be new needs that come up. But essentially, we're paying attention to those things. So what does mapping user needs actually look like? Well, we start off with a value chain on the left-hand axis. So value chain just with y-axis with visible at the top and invisible at the bottom. And then what we do is essentially say, ask a very simple question: who are the users? And you'd actually be surprised when you start to ask particular teams, who are your users, how kind of how differentiating or kind of different the feedback you get from people, like who are your actual users? Are they developers? Are they internal people? Are they external people? There's lots of different users, and many teams actually struggle to articulate who their users actually are. Then once we've established who the users are, we ask what is it they need? And again, does that user need kind of relate to, or is it aligned to what the business actually wants to achieve? Like, are we solving things that aren't actually directly helping the business achieve what it wants to achieve either? So we might actually need to push back on kind of some of the wants if they're not aligned to user needs. We need to understand whether they're kind of existing or expected user needs, or there's something that we need to hypothesize and think, are we making an assumption about what they need? So like nobody knew they needed an iPhone, right, until the iPhone came out. Now suddenly you can't do without an iPhone or Wi-Fi. So some needs are actually, we're making assumptions about that. And you could go back to the Henry Ford quote of, if I'd asked the user for what they wanted, they'd have said faster horses. So sometimes we actually need to discover needs. It's not, you don't easily, it's not as easy just to ask a user, what is it you need? We might need to interpret that through discovery. But the important thing is we actually gain some clarity about what it is that they need, that then drives the next bit, which is, if that's what they need, what capabilities do we as an organization need in order to meet those needs? But we don't necessarily just stop at the surface level capabilities, so the thing that's most or closest to the user. We then kind of continue down the value chain. So what capabilities does that depend on? And what other capabilities does that depend on? So we go down through the chain, and depending on what we're trying to discover as part of the user needs mapping session, we might stop kind of the chain there, or we might explore further. It really depends on what it is we're trying to visualize and the problem we're looking to solve. Then what we might do is just overlay existing teams. So we might say, well, are we actually aligned to meet those particular needs? And if we are, how can we do, are we doing it effectively? And so it starts to visualize that. After we've done that, we can then say, actually, is there a better way in which we can align our team? So if we look at how value flows through the organization, how might that be slightly different? And we might say, well, maybe we could reorganize our teams to say, could a team of 5 to 9 people actually steward these particular capabilities? Would that fit in their heads? Do they have all of the capabilities required to actually deliver that user need and own those capabilities, or is it going to exceed their cognitive load? And then if their cognitive load is exceeded, what support do they need in order to do that? Do we need to introduce platforms or enabling teams, or ways in which we need to upskill them? So it's kind of asking the questions, do the teams that we have, the social part of our system, have all the capabilities they need to build the technical part in order to meet those needs? Now, the observant among you may have spotted that this looks slightly like a Wardley map, and you would be absolutely right, because it's entirely based on Wardley mapping. But what we found was that essentially there's value to be had in just asking those simple questions. So without having the evolutionary aspects of Wardley mapping, which again is massively powerful, oftentimes people don't pick up Wardley mapping because it feels like it's cognitive overhead. Like there's too much to it. It's too hard. So then we don't do it at all. But actually, user needs mapping, essentially, there's massive value to be had in having the conversations about users' needs and capabilities and how we're aligned to meet those before we start talking about evolutionary concepts. And that's the general idea here. So as Simon very nicely says in the forward, if a Wardley map gives you the landscape, then user needs mapping shows you what's been sitting at the end of your street all along. And let's discover what's at the end of the street. And then we can move on to Wardley mapping if it makes sense later. So what does this look like kind of in a case study? So this is walking through a case study from the book. So if you do get the book will go into more detail about this case study, but just to give you an overview of what it might feel like in reality. So Passenger are a mobile ticketing solution company actually based in Bournemouth. And this is kind of the experience that we had as I was working with them a few years ago now to help them reason about how they were organized. So their initial state, they had actually one big, large team that had multiple domains, high dependencies and tight coupling between the capabilities within the organization, and everyone sort of owned everything, which means ultimately nobody owned anything. And they all had the kind of right intentions, good product, but they had heavy kind of coordination overhead. And it was a challenge. So when I was speaking to the CTO, Dave Holbert at the time, I said, how's it feel? What does it feel like? And he very kindly drew this for me. And it just feels like a big ball of mud. And it was kind of this big mush of colors with a few, there's like premium here and there's open data, and we couldn't make sense of how we were organized. Everything was just connected to everything else. So we then said, okay, well, who are the users? And we started to brainstorm and collect various different users. So everything that we went through, but just a selection of those things. So we came up with, well, we've got the bus passenger, but also like the operator. So the bus operators operations team and their scheduling teams. And we started to just brain dump all of the potential users that could be consuming or have needs. Then we started to capture the different needs of the different users. So a particular bus passenger might need to plan a journey, find out where the bus ticket is. The operations team might need to publish disruptions and things like that. So various different needs, and the key thing is that the different users have different needs, and that's what we need to pay attention to. So then we draw the map and we say, well, how do we currently meet those needs? What capabilities do we have that enable us to meet those needs? We capture those on the map, and we start to visualize the big ball of mud. And then, in this instance, we just overlay the current team. So basically, as one team, they just have ownership of everything, and we need to start to reason about this and make some sense of it. So then we begin over a series of sessions, start to kind of work with the map and look for opportunities of low coupling and high cohesion. So where might there be some opportunities to organize our teams around particular areas? And we can move the capabilities on the map to kind of try to minimize the number of crossing lines and see if we can actually visualize cohesion and the way that those particular teams meet the particular needs, having various conversations with different team members to validate whether it makes sense or not. And then once we've kind of got that mapped, we explore various different options, what that could be, and based on their current size, this was how it sort of ended. We ended up actually agreeing that based on the capabilities that they have, we've got this idea of mobile commerce, which would meet kind of planning a journey, finding out where the bus is, buying a ticket. So the sort of bus passenger journey. But then also there were teams around kind of the cities and network and providing services as platforms to that mobile team. So it's the kind of the evolution of starting with the big ball of mud, looking at user needs, starting to build out the value chain and reason about how we might be able to start to evolve the teams. And so Tom Quay essentially really found the user needs mapping specifically helped them to see these unseen ways of kind of organizing their teams, and become a really valuable part of starting to describe and reason about how they could evolve the teams moving forward. So for me then, user needs really are the thing that anchor the outcomes. So when we're looking to get things sooner and change to feel safer, we need to look at how we anchor the outcomes to particular user needs, and visualize within the organization, helping teams to recognize who are the users that we're serving, what are the needs that we're looking to meet, and what's our purpose, how are we actually involved in that value chain. And then when we start to use user needs as a North Star, then we start to enable outcomes to be clearer, we get alignment becomes more tangible, the actual flow constraints become more visible, and then autonomy becomes safer. So user needs essentially sit between strategy and teams. They're the compass that helps organizations move quickly without using direction. And with that, I'll kind of open the floor to any particular questions that people might have.